So I was browsing across YouTube and I got recommended a video called Destroying Breadtube with the Communist Manifesto. I'm intrigued. I like Breadtube. I'm okay with the Communist Manifesto. And I want to know more. So in full disclosure, I went about a minute in just to kind of figure out what part of the Communist Manifesto that he's describing, just so I could pull up my copy next to this in another tab and just have something to go off of and reread what he's saying and explain from my perspective what's going on here if I need to. So with that said, let's take a look at the video.
In the Communist Manifesto,
Mm-hmm.
there is a very brief explanation of what socialism is. And I am going to read it to you, and we are going to talk about this, because there's so much confusion about what socialism is. So many misconceptions. I said many times, I learned in school that communism is that everyone gets paid the same wage no matter how hard they work. Wrong. Communism is not 100% equality of incomes.
No, it is
I
not.
also heard people say communism is when the government does it, right? If the government's involved, that's communism.
Nope.
Wrong. Every country in the world has a government. Every government taxes people. Every government, has a post office or that carries out at least some basic functions. That's wrong.
Abolish the state.
All right? But this is what the Communist Manifesto says about what the communist revolution is. So I'm going to read it to you because there seems to be so much confusion about this. And I'm going to read it to you, and you're going to see this is just like 2 sentences from the Communist Manifesto. And this blows away Breadtube.
He just doesn't get into it.
Go away and shut the hell up after I read this sentence.
Anarchists disagree.
All right. As we have seen, the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class to win the battle for democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And the next sentence, the important part, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie and centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state. The proletariat organizes the ruling class, and to increase total productive forces as rapidly as possible.
Okay.
So Breadtube should die. Should just go away now. They should just...
Why?
Just go away at this point. Right? So it says here, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie and centralize all instruments of production into the hands of the state. Now, what does the state mean?
Tell us. What does the state
mean?
State
Means the government. Right? It means the armed body of men with a legitimacy of armed force. So when all over Breadtube, you see these people say, Marx wasn't a statist. Marx never wanted the government to be involved in anything. Marx did not believe in state involvement. We're against state socialism too. Well, if Marx was against government involvement and he was against the state being involved, why did he write, centralize all instruments of production into the hands of the state?
So let me explain it to you. Using the Communist Manifesto. In the Communist Manifesto, it states, the communist revolution is a radical rupture with traditional property relations. Where were we? We have seen above that the first step in revolution by working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class to win the battle of democracy. Okay, so what do they mean to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy? The fact is most people in that time period who were part of the proletariat did not have enfranchisement. Their voice was not represented. So in order for them to act on the democratic will of the populace, of the majority people, which are the proletariat, as a class, they had to either attain some sort of enfranchisement and then become the ruling class through that method, or they had to use extra legal means, such as overthrowing certain aspects of government, to cast their democratic vote, as it were, for lack of a better word, their democratic position, to enable the will of the majority, i.e. the proletariat should be in charge. Then, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeois, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state. So here's the deal. What is the state? Marx defines it in the next part, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class. So that particular state is in somehow counter to the state of the bourgeois. So we can't necessarily argue that Marx was advocating for the exact same type of state, especially when the word proletariat, which comes from Rome and refers to a certain underprivileged class in Roman history, is mixed with the concept that he tends to use in a lot of his other writings, the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship in this is not how we tend to think of dictators in this day and age, but is more than likely an appeal to the ancient Roman definition, which is what would happen when the Roman Republic went to war or was in crisis. A dictator would come in front of all of the Republic and would speak on their behalf for a period of 6 months, constitutionally written in, to allow for expedient delivery of results. So whereas the Republic was protected by the dictator rising to power for 6 months, and then power was restored back to the Republic, Marx in this section is advocating that the state would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning a temporary position in which the proletariat would protect the revolution. Therefore, it is not a state in quite the same sense as the as what he's purporting that the proletariat would use. It's not a permanent solution. It is a remarkably temporary solution that would be used just as long as it was needed to procure revolution and the safety of revolution, which, as an anarchist, I have a fear in my heart that that can go on forever and tends to go on forever, but I'm sure we'll be getting to parts of that. But from somebody defending the Communist Manifesto and this particular take, that state is not the same state. That state is not the state of the bourgeois. Let's see what else he has to say.
I mean, I'm sorry, but it's like if you think Marx, Marx just said, you and your friends should open a pencil factory where everyone has a fair share. Marx never wanted the government. That's evil Stalinism. Oh, Marx wanted just everyone to start a hippy-dippy co-op in the woods and have a pottery factory and share the profits. Wrong.
The end result was supposed to be communism, a stateless place, a stateless world, a stateless whatever. So yes, Marx did want all the things that you're saying. Maybe not hippy-dippy. I don't know about that part. I'm not going to speak on that. But he did want to reach that point. And for him, the state was a conduit, a temporary measure, a dictatorship in the Roman sense, not in the modern sense, of the proletariat to enforce and protect the needs of the revolution. He claimed in his own lifetime that the Paris Commune in, what year was that? My brain. 1871, I want to say. Let me not make a complete fool of myself. Let me actually look that up. Paris Commune. I was right. He argued that the Paris Commune of 1871 was a perfect example. And from what I understood, it was one of the most democratic institutions in the history of the world at that time. Like, truly democratic. So, yeah. that was his end goal. He wanted to eventually abolish things.
Centralize all instruments of production into the hands of the state. So Breadtube, when they say Marx was not a statist, which is a very common belief, Marx did not believe in the state, Marx did not want the government to be involved. Wrong. Wrong, okay? You can say you don't want that, and you're free to think that you don't want the government involved. That's your business. But don't say that Marx didn't want the government involved. He very clearly wanted the government involved.
An extremely temporary government. It was just to organize until things could be put together. You have to organize something.
Next, right? The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie. Now, what does by degree mean? Means not all at once. By degree. Meaning that there can be a market sector in a socialist society. It doesn't say the proletariat will use its supremacy to immediately seize all capital into the hands of the state. No. It says it will centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, meaning they'll be directed by the state. And it says by degree, all capital will be wrested from the bourgeoisie by degree, meaning it is a gradual process.
So how long is by degree? Does he specify that? I'm not familiar with that particular component. But if we are to take the understanding that Marx would be referring to the dictatorship of the proletariat, again, dictatorship in the Roman sense of the word, we would see it as a temporary and expedient measure that would be used in the immediacy to flow through to protecting the revolution. So one could argue that it is as long as necessary to procure the revolution, which means that once, for example, Soviet Russia reached a point where the threat of the threat of internal forces was gone, it was the job of figures like Lenin and or Stalin to remove themselves from power and to form a true communist nation. Or to create at least some form of democracy, because part of the issue we're dealing with here is a form of enfranchisement. And as for this by degree seizure of production, could by degree have been because having everybody storm every single factory and take it over in an area might have been a little difficult? Maybe it's not so much, oh, let's just have capitalists roaming the nation for like months at a time, and we'll just chill here in like this pseudo state of socialism for years. No, it means I understood that when I read that for the first time as it becomes available. You know? It's not saying, like, oh, just leave a bunch of them floating for a while. It's like, when you can get to it, take them over. Like, that's a side blip. That's not the main message.
Meaning that at some points it may be necessary to have a big market sector. At other points it may be necessary to have everything run by the state. But it does not say the proletariat, everything in a socialist society must be government owned all the time. So people who say Vietnam's not socialist, China's not socialist, Cuba's not socialist because they all have a market sector, well, they're wrong.
It doesn't say necessarily that it's the government. They're not acting as a government. They're a temporary state. It's like, I feel like that's where we're just going to disagree almost this entire video, where he's going to keep talking about how the state, and I'm just going to keep saying, well, but the dictatorship is a temporary position. And we're just going to be in a place where we're not really saying anything to each other.
They are all totally 100% wrong, right? Next, right? The proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. What does increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible mean? Now, does that mean at that point we make sure that everyone is poor and it's fair, right? Libertarians say this all the time, right? Socialism is about making everyone equally poor. What does increase the total productive forces as that doesn't mean make people poorer. And this is a big thing among Breadtube and the synthetic left also. Oh, people have too much stuff, right? We need to go.
Okay, I'm just going to stop him right here because you have to look at the context of Marx's time. That particular section is something that Kropotkin writes about too. Okay. Increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads or on the rights of property and on the conditions of the bourgeois production. By means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which in the course of the movement outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. So the point is that he's trying to say there is, one, we're going to start off using the means of production of the people from before, the bourgeois class. We're probably going to look like them a little bit. But we'll make inroads and we'll make the changes necessary as we revolutionize the modes of production. Fair enough. But the point he's going for is the increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. In Marx's time, the way that capitalists function is that they would run factories, and when a certain thing reached a certain level of surplus in the economy, all the factories would shut down. Why? Because it prevented access to those resources to the common person. So it had a dual effect. One, you shut down the factory as the business owner. They are not going to suffer for that. You wait several months as the business owner, you restart the factory, and surplus has dropped, demand for your product is high, you're able to sell it at a higher price. You make tons of money. More money than if you had all the machines running, because the machines could have gotten damaged in those 3 months. However, if you are a worker and you are dependent for food and work from that employer, and they randomly shut the factory down for 3 months, you're out of a job and you're out of money. And these institutions were not paying you. You had to go try to find another factory, probably in another industry, to try to make ends meet, assuming you had that option of choice, which is a very limited choice to begin with. So what he's saying and advocating for in this particular spot is, and I do have to add, those workers could not buy and afford the things that they were making because they were at outrageous prices that were well beyond the means of what they could earn making those things for that period of time. Had production continued and surplus been expanded, they might have been able to afford some of those goods. So what he's advocating for here is the increase of total productive forces as rapidly as possible, i.e., supply and demand be damned. Forget the market. Make as many things as possible to serve the needs of people. That is what he's saying in that part. So, if we understand this correctly, he's advocating for a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat as the ruling class that will increase the total productive force as fast as possible, i.e., make as many goods and services so that most people can get access to goods and basic resources that they were denied from the bourgeois class when they didn't have to be. This is not the same thing as the modern world where we have reached such a level of overproduction and overconsumption, where we're having cell phones that we're replacing every single year, where it's cheaper and more efficient to replace a product than it is to purchase a new one. We're in a very different lived reality than what Marx lived in. And I don't think that we should be taking his word identical for what it is, but understanding it in the context of his time and understanding the deeper message behind it, which to me strikes as the workers should be striving to disrupt the property relations and traditional ideas of capitalism, ignore the objections they have with communism, seize control as often as possible, and take over the means of production, and become the state temporarily, and become the capitalist temporarily, until you can reach a point where you can move past it. When I read Marx, that's how I understood it. I don't know where he's getting his particular perspective from. It almost seems like he's just apologizing for a lot of the declared socialist states. Which, if he does, I will break down why they are not socialist either.
Get poorer, right? We need to lower consumption to help Mother Earth. People need to stop having children because there's too many people in the world. No.
Who advocates for that?
After all instruments of production are in the hands of the state, they increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Right? So we have the proletariat using its political supremacy, taking control of the government,
and
then seizing by degree capital economic centers from the bourgeoisie, by degree, meaning as necessary as they want to.
Not as necessary as you want to, it's as you're able to. He's not advocating that we send in, every person to take over every factory at once. He's saying send people in as we can to take over factories. The end goal is still, in the revolution, to take over the means of production. You are losing the goal at the short-sightedness of wanting to defend your stateness.
And centralizing, that's the important line, centralizing all instruments of production in the hands of the state.
When did it say that? I don't think my copy uses the word centralize. Oh, yes, it does. Hold on. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeois, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. the proletariat organized as the ruling class. So you want to centralize all the instruments of production in the hands of the state. What are you talking about? You want to centralize the instruments of production in the hands of the proletariat. That's what it's saying. The state in this example, again, is a temporary measure that represents the proletariat. It's not what he's saying. If you just want to defend statism and you want to argue for communism within that, I don't believe that that's what Marx says. I'm probably never going to convince this guy of anything. Honestly, he just sounds like he's apologizing for some really messed up stuff. Because centralize even just, I think further produces it. You want to centralize it. You want to take it completely under the control of that state, of that temporary government. I don't know.
Meaning that even if there's private corporations, they still must do as the state central plan says, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Meaning the state, at the center of the economy, organizes the economy to grow and expand and make everyone as wealthy as possible, as quickly as possible.
Okay, in Marx's era, expanding the production like that would have just tanked the economy. It would have tanked it. There would have been so much supply within the state that they would have been able to have lower class people affording it. That was the goal. The goal wasn't to prop up a state institution and start shipping things off to other nations. Marx ideally probably would have wanted this to start happening in multiple parts of the world at once. I don't understand this perspective on Marx at all.
To increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. So not abolish billionaires, right? What is abolish billionaires? It's a big thing, right? AOC, Bernie, abolish billionaires, right? No, it's not about making people poor. It's not about making sure no one can ever be as wealthy as a billionaire is in 2020. It's about increasing the total productive forces as rapidly as possible.
A billionaire, which made its money off of the backs and labor of the proletariat class, is someone that Marx very much would be speaking of as one of the people against communism, and the idea of communism, and his means of production. And I say his because more than likely, if they are a billionaire, they are represented through the ownership by someone who identifies with he and him pronouns. If that person was then to be told, you need to seize up some of your billions of dollars to pay for things, that would be perfectly reasonable. I don't understand what you're getting at. Second of all, there were no billionaires in Marx's day. We're talking about a completely different economic system. It's a completely different means and understanding of the world. When a capitalist nation overproduces now, it sells its product off to developing nations. It sells itself off to other developed countries. It doesn't just hold a surplus. We're not talking about increasing the industry to, mass produce the wealth of a nation. We're talking about making sure that people have enough. And as someone who advocates that over time, we should be pushing for more and more wealth within the average person's life, it should come at a relative equality. Because we're all working at a relatively the same level. We are trying to get equal opportunity, not equality of outcome necessarily. Not every artist wants to be a scientist. But everybody should have food and water and shelter and resources, especially in today's world. And some of those things may or may not have been considered unfathomable to someone like Marx in his time. But they're possible. We can do better. Marx is a foundation, not the solution. And furthermore, I don't think Marx is saying what you're saying.
This sentence I just read to you, where Karl Marx explains the purpose of the communist revolution, has China written all over it. That is China. The proletariat, the proletarian party, the Chinese Communist Party, took control of the state in 1949. And they have wrested by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, meaning sometimes they've had a totally nationalized economy.
By degree. You're pivoting on those two words so much. Gradually, in steps. That means you actually have to be doing it. Little by little, gradually. That doesn't mean 50 years later, you're sitting there buddy-buddy with capitalists and trying to be like, hey, I'm a socialist, right? Right, guys? I'm the best socialist.
Now they have more of a market sector. However, they have centralized all instruments of production in the hands of the state, meaning that even private corporations must do what the Chinese state central planners, what the 5-year plan, what the Communist Party wants done. Right? And what has China done? They have increased the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. They have turned China into the second largest economy in the world. They have raised 800 million people out of poverty, right? By centralizing the instruments of production in the hands of the state, they have then raised the productive forces as rapidly as possible.
Is it a democracy? Are the people being represented by the state? Are the proletariat actually the state? Or is there a state class that once may have been arbitrarily the chosen group of the proletariat that is no longer representative of the proletariat's needs? How can one say that a state is socialist when Marx's reasoning for advocating for socialism was that democracy needed to be heard, that the will of the proletariat, who was the majority of workers, needed to express themselves democratically and thus take over the state as a dictatorship, which China is not in that one sense of the word, right? It's not in the Roman sense of the word. It might be in the, not so Roman sense of the word, right? So, no. You're wrong. If there's no democraticness, if the leader is not calling to the people, if the proletariat are not the ones speaking, but a state on behalf of the proletariat, a state class that has separate powers and is distinct from the people, all that is saying is that you managed to create a new bourgeois class, not a proletariat class, a new bourgeois class that has more power than the average proletariat, can enforce violence over the proletariat, and is not part of the proletariat. Therefore, you are not in socialism, because at that point the proletariat does not control the means of production. And this is coming from an anarchist who kind of says, hey, we need to abolish the state at the same time as we abolish capitalism, because states corrupt. And what I'm talking about in terms of this is maybe this was socialist at one point, but it corrupted. And I don't know if that's inevitable. I'm not willing to say it's inevitable that it will happen. I'd like to be wrong about it being inevitable, because to be perfectly honest, I would be happier to get to communism than to be right about its reasons, right? Like, as an anarchist, I think that the state is no way to go to get to there. But if I was wrong, like, and the state actually did manage to do it, I wouldn't be like me sitting there going, you know what, we didn't get there by the state, my stateless way, so this isn't real. I'd be saying, well, I guess we got there by the state, I guess I was kind of wrong. And then I'd be like, well, I'm happy, we're in communism, I don't gotta deal with crap anymore. I don't gotta deal with this BS. Like, we're done here. Am I going to be infringed upon by a state institution? Is some state going to be able to violence me? No, then I'm good. I'm really good.
So anyone who says China is not socialist needs to just read this sentence, right? Maybe you don't think that's what socialism is, but what Marx said socialism is, China is 100% in compliance with. The proletariat used its political supremacy, i.e. the Communist Party, the Workers' Party, took control of the state. It wrested by degree all capital, meaning that they seized some businesses, they didn't seize others, but...
If you truly believe that the Communist Party of China is a representation of the proletariat, truly a representation of the proletariat, and has some sort of democracy, then you and I are coming at things from such a fundamentally different level that I don't know if we can ever agree, and I don't know how that happens. When you're advocating not for the end goal, but the temporary goal of a person's work as the final conclusion. Maybe you want a different thing from the rest of us on the left. But this is not what it is. Just because you do not have the imagination or the ability to think past statism does not mean the rest of us need to follow on that ship with you. Marx had the idea. The state was just a tool. It was a temporary measure. It was a dictatorship.
But they made a decision. They've centralized all instruments of production in the hands of the state, not worker cooperatives, but in the hands of the state, right? Marx wasn't a statist, Caleb. Marx didn't believe in the government doing anything. Well, in the hands of the state, that's pretty clear. And they then increased the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. No. They didn't make everyone equal. No, they didn't increase, their goal was not to decrease income inequality and get money out of politics. Not Rachel Maddow, Karl Marx, right? Now, the next sentence, the next paragraph, he talks about, he says,
oh, thank goodness he moved on.
Can be affected except by despotic inroads on the rights of property, right? Meaning government taking property by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitating further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. And then he says this sentence. Again, another sentence that people just can't comprehend. He says, quote, "These measures will, of course, be different in different countries."
Okay.
How many times I've been said, I want socialism with American characteristics. That's racist. You're racist. You want to... These measures will, of course, be different in different countries, meaning the way they do it in Russia is not going to be the way they do it in China.
And the way they did it in the 1800s in Germany will probably not be the way that it ever happens anywhere else. You're willing to take the country line in that context, but you're not willing to take the time thing in that context. Okay.
They do it in Cuba is not going to be the way they do it in China. The way that they do it in Venezuela is not going to be the same way they do it in Cuba. And the way we do it in the United States.
Yes, but they actually have to do it. They actually have to do it. Not just give it lip service.
States is going to be unique. These measures, of course, will be different in different countries. So, yes, the United States does have a unique road towards socialism. It's going to be different in different countries. Most advanced countries, the following will generally be applicable. And he lists 10 planks, which were in 1848 in Europe. Most countries, these were reasonable demands. I'm not going to go over them.
Now you appeal to the time. Okay.
But it was applied. Now can look at what I just read and say China's not socialist.
It's not.
I don't know how people can look at what I just read and say Marx didn't believe in the government doing anything. I don't know how anybody can look at what I just read and say that, it's offensive to talk about socialism with American characteristics. It's offensive to say that the United States has a unique road to socialism. I don't know how anyone can look at what I just said and said Marx wanted everyone to be poorer. I don't know how anyone can look at what I just said and said the goal is to make sure that no one is a billionaire or no one lives as a billionaire currently lives. I'm sorry, he lays it all out there. It's all there. But this is just, it's a few paragraphs. It's a Communist Manifesto.
When you're unwilling to look at certain key components of why he wrote those words and the language in which he wrote those words and their context, I see how you can come up with a conclusion. Right now, that reminds me of, when there's situations where people take little things out of context that people say and are generally dishonest about them. That stuff happens from time to time. I don't understand that interpretation of Marx. But what maybe I'm the wrong one. Maybe I'm the wrong one. But no, I've always understood Marx as using the state as a temporary measure. When I read his book, I read through that particular section, and I came through it thinking that the state was temporary. I've always kind of had that understanding that his state was temporary because communism was the end goal. When you're not looking at that end goal, but just prolonging socialism in that particular way, you could indefinitely, just sit on that and say that you're socialist, but if you're not actually progressing, by degree at a even gradual rate, then you're not really fixing it. Anyway, my name is Anarchist Tara. I hope you enjoyed watching. Tell me what you think down below in the comments. Give me a like if you thought I'm good, and you like this video, and you like the content I'm producing. Give it a thumbs down if I got my take completely wrong on this one. And with that said, I hope you have a great day.